Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. Very sorry to tell you that I will not be using a PowerPoint presentation. I hope you're not too disappointed. The title of this panel perplexed me from the moment I first read it, and in fact it contains the key to the problem within it. Audience development, a paradox so deeply wrong that we hardly even realize there's anything unusual about it. One of the most dominant reasons behind the tragic disintegration of Western culture is the fact it stopped being relevant. Culture and art in particular started as a way of marking and creating an identity, and always justified its existence by being exactly that. Since art lost its relevance, we started having to develop audience. For in fact, when a legitimate message has to be heard, regardless of whether complimentary or critical, the listener doesn't have to be developed. He or she are summoned by the commanding urgency and necessity of the matter. Music, as well as art in general, started as a form of communication. It is a universal language which connects people of all religions, countries, races, and genders, and communication can only flow when there is an open partner on each end. One of the most tragic developments over the past 100 years is that we have ceased to communicate and started creating art for art's sake. And even more tragically, nowadays artists create art for their own sake. Art which isn't relevant, and by relevant I mean that it affects not only its creator but also its receiver, is not legitimate. And quite frankly, we should not expect either our governments to pay for it nor our audiences to appreciate it. We artists have lost contact to our audience, and we have nobody else to blame but ourselves. Because people, regardless of education, previous knowledge, disposition or taste, are not stupid, as we so readily wish to believe. We lost respect for our audience. We started taking them for fools. Our audience can detect sincerity and conviction much better than specialists. They feel whether we have a sincere message to say and stand behind what we're expressing, or we're only doing our job. We have nobody to blame for the fact we need to start developing audiences, or if we leave diplomacy aside, for the fact we're risking extinction. It is all our own fault. We musicians have managed to chase every single bit of a valid exchange away from the concert halls, and it ended up with an ever-aging audience of routine concertgoers who are so often only interested in reassuring their habits and hearing what they're used to. Many of my co-speakers yesterday and today spoke about the meaning of culture and its importance and value. I think the fact we have to explain that is already tragic, but it is indeed a gloomy reality that some policymakers really think that the support of culture is actually a choice. On the other hand, despite being a musician myself, I find it often hard to blame politicians for not seeing the relevance of certain institutions. Noticing that fewer and fewer people seem to show interest in their activities, why should governments pay for institutions that are in some cases more resembling a mausoleum to a deceased civilization than a center of relevant exchange? They should, because those institutions are our history and our identity. But we must also make sure we justify their existence. Cultural organizations have always had a very challenging proportion between cost and income. If we calculate the actual real price of a ticket to the opera, we realize how incredibly unbalanced the relation is. I truly believe this should still be possible, even in our days of media and unbelievable speed of information, but it is not ethically correct, nor is it realistic to expect public funds to be spent on these incredibly expensive institutions if so few people are interested in what they have to offer. We've been talking a lot about many new ideas and concepts and programs that should have solved this problem. If we are honest to ourselves and do a little bit of research, we must admit that 10 years ago and even 20 years ago, many of these issues were already being discussed, and many of these ideas have already been incorporated. Not much has changed, though. I think we should stop blaming our politicians for cutting funding to the arts and start giving them irresistible reasons not to do so. These reasons can only be relevance. In an era where European identity is such an issue, where the validity of the European Union is being questioned every day, we must ask ourselves where our core Europeans should derive their national, or in this case, continental identity from. People used to extract pride and the feeling of belonging through accomplished battles and charismatic, albeit brutal leaders. They used to identify themselves through elements which were exclusive of others rather than embracing and tolerant. They used to define themselves through the poverty of their neighbors, through the superiority of their armies. Fortunately, we have learned at least a little bit from history. Nowadays, we can also define ourselves a little bit through our culture. Our culture is our common heritage. In fact, it is our intellectual and spiritual DNA. It is this heritage, which we have almost lost a few times over the past century, which has become our most valuable treasure. It is only through this heritage, which is only relevant when it is a stimulant to present exchange, not the ever-ending recycling of old truths, that we can keep, develop, and in fact eventually attain a real European identity. My colleagues and I founded the International Mahler Orchestra in 2006 because we believe that music is an extraordinary tool through which people can communicate regardless of their entirely different realities. I remember my growing frustration at the arrogant world of so-called classical music, where young people who would try to go to a concert for the first time in their lives would be shied away by the stiffness and staticness of the experience and would not feel inclined to ever come back. Even more tragically, they would not feel comfortable to honestly admit that they simply didn't enjoy it. The arrogance of our musical world can be felt in every corner, the musicians often radiating almost complete indifference to the existence of human beings on those seats. Those young listeners, not yet aware of the social rule of, even if you just spend the entire concert snoring comfortably on your seat, make sure you say you found it interesting. Or your conversation partner might think you are not sophisticated. None of them would iterate, they would iterate shamefully this terribly painful, all-too-common sentence, I'm sure the music was great, but I haven't understood it. And this is how the most unfortunate misconception in art started, the notion that art has to be understood. We believe that music should reach and move people. It should communicate a sensation or a message that everybody can identify with, regardless of what they know and how much money they have, and that they definitely don't have to understand anything or possess any sort of previous knowledge in order to be moved by it. Because a musical performance is an experience, it's not a manual of a washing machine. If our music hasn't reached our audience, it means we have done something wrong, not our audience. I think the main mistake among most artists as well as policymakers is the discreet, perhaps even subconscious conviction that there is something wrong with the audience. Deep inside, in a way, we all look down at our listeners, try to manipulate them, not really believing in the validity of their judgment. No, there is nothing wrong with the audience. We have just stopped taking it seriously. Our audience isn't stupid. If we don't start believing that our audience can tell real quality, we will not have a healthy rapport between initiator and receptor, between messenger and listener, between artist and audience, and that is the end of relevance. Quality is not about cold, measurable elements. In music, we are saturated and fed up with the perfect violinist and the perfect pianist and the perfect everything. We are all starting to sound like computers. We must also not be fooled by an ever-decreasing substance and real conviction replaced by pseudo-temperament, wild gestures, and all wrapped nicely in something we all like to call passion. No, this isn't quality. Quality is about sincerity, it's about individualism, it's about having an own voice, the courage and the integrity to express it, and the means to do so in a clear, selfless manner. Sincerity is something every human being on this planet can detect. They don't have to know anything about music. They don't have to own a big house or drive a fancy car. They have to have an open heart and perhaps leave a couple of prejudices at home. Nowadays, one encounters many attempts, or as they fashionably call them, concepts, trying to bring classical music to the people. One hears about the most bizarre examples of these very often very condescending attempts to change the form, but not do anything real about the totally void content. Concerts in a nightclub, musicians wearing jeans, pieces not lasting more than 5 minutes, a cool moderator talking about Mozart's sex life. We've seen it all. These ideas are all perfectly legitimate and fine as long as they remain secondary. The problem is they become more important than the actual music. I'm personally very surprised to realize that very often those fantastic minds behind these programs don't realize that by sending the message, we're trying to appeal to you because we're desperately needing an audience, we're actually saying what we're offering you isn't good, so we are wrapping it in an awful lot of sugar so you don't notice you're actually being fooled. We must not forget that it is fairly easy, or at least reasonably realistic, to bring somebody to a concert for the first time. Most people are at the end of the day willing to leave their prejudices at home once. The big challenge is to make them come a second time. Our responsibility is to offer them something so irresistibly sincere that they will not be able to say no to a return. I truly believe that assuring this is the case is a much higher priority than seducing people with random goodies and digestible concepts that often lead to a dull, unengaging experience. We should stop meddling with the packaging and start offering sincere and truthful content to our public. My colleagues and I founded our orchestra in an era where so many orchestras closed down and one gets constantly asked, why yet another one? Because we strongly believe that the only way a sensation can be communicated to an audience in such a way that it reaches those who are open and opens those who haven't opened yet is if every single person playing on a common stage can stand behind the message they're expressing. We do not see the orchestral situation as a mass of people who are little elements in a big machine, but rather as a collection of individuals who each has an own voice, which should be allowed to express itself, all uniting behind one common message. The International Mahler Orchestra, which consists of members from all over Europe, of all age groups, religions, and nationalities, has put as one of its main goals the complete abolishment of hierarchy and the establishment of direct democracy in the orchestral situation, because we strongly believe that all people are equal, and similarly, we also believe that all voices should be heard. We come together a few times a year, united by a lot of idealism and dealing with an ever more uncertain reality, because we truly wish to share something with our public. In our orchestra, we make music as a group because we believe in the same goals. We express our ideas together because we believe that together we are stronger than alone. But first and foremost, we believe that we can only reach all of you if each one of us really believes in what they say. In 2011, we went on a long tour in Germany, presenting Gustav Mahler's 10th Symphony to the public. When drafting our plans for that tour, we decided to make an experiment and aim at non-traditional audiences and advertise in untypical media. We did not advertise in one single classical music magazine. We didn't hang posters in the underground or anything of the sort. We tried to reach all those people who have never heard the word Mahler in their lives. This piece, not quite an easy nut to chew, goes on for 80 minutes and is quite a challenge even for very experienced musicians, listeners, and Mahler experts. We marked a record of over 62% first-time concertgoers throughout the tour. But the most important element for us was the survey we conducted at the end of each concert. It only had one question: would you come back? An overwhelming majority of over 90% expressed their wish to experience more. The concerts weren't particularly unusual. We didn't have violinists in bikini, nor did we play in a nightclub. Of course, the atmosphere was substantially more relaxed than a normal concert, but this was hardly a factor. The fact is, there were 80 people on that stage, each with a very personal message and a large collective message, who felt a sincere wish to share it with our audience. You can call it democracy, you can call it pluralism, we call it sincerity. And perhaps before we ask ourselves how to develop audiences, we should start by having a sincere message to say. Perhaps the crowd will come and listen. Thank you very much.